For 3 years, Elias Marchetti hadn't swallowed a single bite of food cooked by another human being. Not one. He was 34 years old, tall enough that men stepped aside without meaning to, black hair going silver at the temples, a thin scar riding the line of his jaw, and he ran the most powerful family in Boston, from behind a charcoal 3-piece suit and a pair of eyes nobody held for long. Doctors couldn't explain it. His own men whispered about it. In his world, a man's strength is measured at the dinner table, and a boss who can't eat is a boss who's already finished. So he starved in private, dropped weight he couldn't afford to lose, and lied to everyone. Then, on a freezing Tuesday night in February, his car stalled under an overpass in South Boston, and 20 steps away a woman was stirring a battered pot over a broken burner, feeding a line of people who had nowhere else to be. She was 27, small, red-brown hair pinned up in a hurry, cracked lips, a burn scar running from the back of her left hand past her elbow, and a faded yellow cloth bag slung over her shoulder, its strap carrying a faint, scorched mark from the fire 3 years ago. She didn't have a home, she didn't have money, and she didn't have a name she was willing to say out loud. She looked at that black armored car and saw something nobody else in Boston could see anymore. Not wealth, not danger. A man who was starving, so she filled a bowl and carried it over to a window that hadn't once come down for a stranger, and she said, "Eat. It's cold out here." What happened in the next 30 seconds would tear apart everything Elias Marchetti thought he knew about the night his mother died. If this story moves you, hit that like button and subscribe so you don't miss what comes next. Share it with someone who still believes one small act of kindness can change a life. Your support means everything to us. Now let's go back to that overpass in South Boston, to a cold February night, and to the bowl of soup that changed 2 lives forever. His jaw tightened out of habit. For 3 years, that had always come first, the clenching along his jaw, then the spasm rising from his stomach, a reflex his body had learned so thoroughly that it no longer required thought. Elias Marchetti swallowed the first spoonful and waited. He waited for the nausea, waited for his throat to close like a trapdoor, waited for the moment when he would have to turn his face away and pretend there was an important call he needed to take, as he had done at so many banquet tables, so many meetings, so many meals people had laid out in his honor. But it didn't come. He sat motionless in the darkened car, the spoon still suspended in his hand, and the only thing he felt was warmth spreading down into his chest. A second spoonful, then a third. Nothing happened. No spasm, no bitter taste rising behind his tongue, no fear. There was only the hot broth and some fragrance lifting from the surface of the bowl, a scent that made him want to close his eyes without understanding why. He began to eat faster. Then, faster still, so quickly that even he felt ashamed, eating like a man who had just been released from somewhere, eating as though this damned miracle would vanish if he slowed down for even a second. When he set the bowl aside, it was completely empty. Outside, Warren Doyle was still standing beside the open hood, holding a flashlight that had gone dark at some point. The man who had driven for 3 generations of the Marchetti family, who had held Elias when the boy was only 3 days old, who had never once shown emotion in front of anyone in the family, now stood there wearing the expression of a man who had just witnessed something that wasn't supposed to happen. He said nothing. He didn't dare say anything. Elias opened the door and stepped out, and the February cold struck his face like a slap. The woman had returned to the pot and was ladling soup for an old man in a threadbare knit cap. The line was still long. Not one of them looked at him a second time. And that was the strangest thing about the entire evening, because in this city, people always looked at him twice. Elias took out his wallet. He didn't count. He had never needed to count. He simply pinched a stack of bills between 2 fingers and held it out, but she looked down at his hand and shook her head. She gently pushed his hand away. Not hard, only enough to make him understand. "If you pay for it, then it becomes a transaction," she said. "But if I give it to you, then it remains a gift." Elias stood there with the money in his hand and didn't know what to do with it. In his world, everything had a price. Every promise, every favor, every nod exchanged in a conference room was entered into some invisible ledger, and sooner or later, someone always came to collect. He had lived his entire life within that system, and believed there was no other way for 2 human beings to give anything to one another. Yet this woman had just given him something an entire empire couldn't buy, and then refused to accept anything in return. "What's your name?" he asked. Her hands paused for the briefest moment, so brief that anyone else would have missed it. But Elias Marchetti had survived this long because he noticed pauses like that. She gave him a name. She said it calmly, meeting his gaze without blinking, exactly the way a person spoke a name they had used for so long that they had almost come to believe it was their own. Then she turned away because someone else was waiting, and he asked no further questions. The tow truck arrived amid the growl of its engine and yellow lights sweeping across the tents. Warren closed the hood, glanced toward his employer, and Elias climbed into the other car that was already waiting. He didn't look back. As the wheels rolled through a puddle beneath the overpass, he slipped a hand inside his shirt and closed his fingers tightly around the ring hanging from the chain around his neck, the ring that had belonged to a woman who had died in his arms beside a tablecloth that was still perfectly white. For the first time since that night, the metal didn't feel cold against his palm. The line slowly dissolved along with the tow truck's lights, and only when nothing remained in the pot but a layer of sediment at the bottom did she realize that both her hands were numb with cold. She pulled the warped lid into place, put out the coals, then sat down on the plastic crate she always used as a chair. Inside the tent, the only light came from a flashlight hanging upside down from a length of wire, casting a glow over a space just wide enough for her to do what had to be done every night. She pulled the tin box from her cloth bag, opened the lid, and emptied the small amount of money into her palm. Crumpled bills, cold coins. One bill someone had folded into quarters and slipped through the gap in the box while she wasn't looking. She smoothed each bill flat, arranged them by denomination like someone who still believed order meant something, then put them back into the box and closed the lid. She didn't count aloud. She never counted aloud, because hearing the number was always worse than simply knowing it. On the wall of the tent, where the tarp had been patched with duct tape, hung a yellowed sheet of grid paper. She picked up a ballpoint pen that was nearly out of ink, drew a diagonal line through another square, then sat looking at the row of remaining squares for a long while. The number of unmarked squares grew smaller every day, and she had learned not to think about what would happen when the last one was crossed out. She put the pen away, lifted the lid, and ladled what remained at the bottom of the pot into her plastic bowl. It had gone cold and thick. The sediment no one wanted settled at the bottom. She ate all of it slowly, sitting cross-legged on a blanket folded in half, and gave no thought to why she always ate last. That was simply how it had always been. Outside, the wind threaded through the gap between the two bridge pillars and let out a long, keening whistle. She was washing her bowl with the water left in the jug when she heard familiar footsteps, the slightly uneven rhythm of someone advanced in years who still refused to walk slowly. Dorothy Wade pulled back the tarp and ducked inside, carrying with her the smell of cold coffee and the chill of an entire walk through the night. She stood there looking at the empty pot, then at the plastic bowl that hadn't yet dried, and released a sigh the woman had heard more times than she could count over the past 3 years. "You were the last one again," she said. The woman shrugged. "Everyone else has eaten, Dorothy." Dorothy didn't argue. She had managed the Dawn Harbor shelter long enough to understand that some arguments could never be won. They could only be lost more slowly. She sat down on the edge of the plastic crate, rubbed her hands together, then said what she had come to say. "Remember to come early this Sunday." The woman stopped in the middle of what she was doing. The bowl in her hands was still streaked with soap suds, and for that brief moment, she could no longer hear the wind. "I know," she said. "I've never been late." Dorothy nodded, and there was something very gentle in the way she did it. She knew. She was only reminding her. Then she added that someone had asked about the documents that week, that everything was still moving forward, only slowly, and anything involving paperwork was always slow. "I understand," the woman replied. She had said those words so many times that they no longer meant anything. Dorothy studied her for a moment, then asked whether anything had happened that evening. She had heard that an expensive car had broken down outside. "There was a hungry man," the woman said. "I fed him." Dorothy waited, but she said nothing more, and Dorothy didn't ask. After Dorothy left, the woman remained alone within that small pool of light, folded her yellow apron, and placed it at the head of her blanket as she did every night, then lay down and turned her face toward the wall. The name she had spoken that evening was still resting somewhere inside her mouth, hard and unfamiliar, like a pebble she had held between her teeth for so long that she had forgotten it wasn't one of them. The next morning, Elias went down to the kitchen before daylight had fully broken and told the cook to make him a bowl of soup. The woman had worked in the mansion since his father was alive, and there was nothing to fault in her skill. She nearly trembled with happiness when she heard the request, because it had been a very long time since the master of the house had asked for anything to eat. It took her nearly an hour. She used broth that had been simmering since the night before, along with the most expensive ingredients in the house, and carried it in with both hands, holding the tray steady, as though she were bearing something that might shatter. Elias sat down at the long dining table he hadn't used in 3 years. He picked up the spoon. He lifted a spoonful, and before he could swallow, his throat closed like a door someone on the other side had slammed shut, and everything that followed was something he knew so well that he no longer felt ashamed. He set the spoon down very gently, because if he put it down too hard, someone would hear. He thanked her and said he had eaten a late breakfast, so he wasn't hungry yet. He spoke in a voice calm enough for the cook to bow and withdraw without daring to look at the untouched bowl of soup. When the door closed, Elias sat motionless for a long time before the table set for 12 and understood something he didn't want to understand. The night before hadn't been a recovery. It had been an exception. His body hadn't opened its door to the world again. It had opened only once, for one particular hand, and he had no way to explain why. Warren knocked on the door 10 minutes later, and he didn't need to look at the bowl to know what had happened. He stopped 2 paces from the table, clasped his hands behind his back, then said what he had spent the entire night considering. "Give me 3 days," he said. "In 3 days, I'll know where she came from, what she used to do, and whether anyone is behind her. You know I'm not saying this out of curiosity." Elias raised his eyes to him. In the morning light, his employer's face looked more hollow than usual, but nothing in his eyes had changed, and Warren knew at once that he had made the wrong offer. "No," Elias said. "Young master, if she was planted there, this is exactly how someone would do it. A poor woman, a bowl of soup, a chance encounter one evening. I've seen schemes far more sophisticated than this begin in ways much cruder." "I know," Elias said. "Then give me 3 days." "No," Elias said for the second time, and this time he offered no explanation. Warren remained there for another moment, then bowed his head and withdrew. In the old driver's mind was the very clear thought that this was the first time in many years his employer had refused to learn something he should have wanted to know. Near noon, the telephone rang. The name on the screen belonged to one of the men who sat at the head of the council table, a man whose voice was always as warm as though he were offering someone birthday blessings. He asked after the young master's health. He said he had heard that Elias had lost a great deal of weight lately, said that nobody could endure such a workload at his age, and added that his family knew an excellent doctor, a very discreet one, whom he could arrange for Elias to see if necessary. Elias let him finish. He didn't interrupt him once, and it was that silence that made the man on the other end speak longer than he had intended, adding things he had no reason to say until his voice began to falter. Then Elias asked, his tone still perfectly ordinary, "Who told you that I had lost weight?" Silence answered from the other end. Elias didn't repeat the question. He simply waited, and the pause lasted long enough for the other man to understand that he had just revealed something. "It's only a rumor," the man said. "You know how people are. They're always talking." "Then please tell those people for me," Elias replied, "that I can still eat." The call ended sooner than either man had expected. Elias placed the telephone face down on the table and sat staring at the bowl of soup that had gone completely cold before him. That evening, he told Warren to drive beneath the overpass, and he did the same the following night. By the third night, he had stopped taking out his wallet. He simply sat in the car with the bowl of soup resting on his lap, the window lowered halfway, listening to people line up and talk among themselves outside, and he ate every last spoonful. It went on that way for 7 nights. Not once did he ask another question, and not once did she ask who he was. Some nights, she handed him the bowl and turned away at once because the line was still long. On other nights, she lingered for a little while, her hands tucked into the pockets of her apron, and the two of them exchanged a few scattered words about the weather, about how wet charcoal took longer to catch, about an old man in the encampment who had been coughing all week. Warren noticed that his employer had begun to sleep again, and that he was beginning to fill out the shirt that had still hung loose around his collar for years. Then, on the 7th night, there was nothing beneath the overpass. No tents, no people, no firelight. There was only an empty stretch of concrete washed clean by the rain, several painted markings left by the city cleanup crew, and in the farthest corner, where she had always set up her pot, the charcoal stove lay crushed beneath the wheels of a garbage truck. It was twisted out of shape. One leg snapped and bent outward, like something someone had been determined to trample flat. Elias got out of the car. He stood beneath the headlights, staring at the stove for a long time, while Warren remained behind him without speaking, because he had driven this man long enough to know when silence was the safest choice. Then Elias said, "Find her." Warren replied, "Young master, you forbade me from doing that." "I'm not asking you to investigate her," Elias said. "I'm asking you to find her. Those are two different things." Finding her took a day and a half, and it required nothing that belonged to the family. Warren only had to ask several people from the old encampment who had since scattered to different places. And every one of them gave him the same name. The name of a shelter at the end of a narrow street in South Boston. A 2-story red brick building with a faded wooden sign that read Dawn Harbor. Elias walked inside by himself late one afternoon. Warren offered to go in first, and Elias told him no. The door opened into a large common room, filled with rows of long tables and the mingled smells of weak coffee and clothes that hadn't completely dried. There were several dozen people inside. Some were eating, some were folding blankets, and 2 men sat playing chess with pieces from mismatched sets. When Elias crossed the threshold in a charcoal 3-piece suit and shoes untouched by a single speck of dust, the entire room fell silent. It wasn't silence born of fear. It was silence born of understanding. The people sitting in that room had lived on the streets long enough to know that when a man like him walked into a place like this, either someone was about to lose something, or someone was about to be made to repay a debt. The sound of spoons touching bowls ceased. The chess game stopped. Elias stood there, and for the first time in many years, he became aware that his presence was spoiling something decent. Then came the familiar sound of brisk, resolute footsteps from the stairs, and Dorothy Wade strode between the 2 rows of tables. She stopped exactly an arm's length from him, blocking the way into the rest of the building like a door made of flesh and bone. She didn't reach his shoulder. She didn't step back either. "I know who you are," she said. "Everyone in this neighborhood does." Elias didn't deny it. She looked him over from head to toe, slowly and without concealment, then asked him directly, her voice quiet, though everyone in the room could hear. "What do you want with that girl?" Elias didn't answer at once. On the way there, he had prepared several things to say. Words about a job, about wages, about a reasonable offer anyone in her circumstances would accept. Now he understood that speaking any of them would be a lie. So he told the truth, and he said it softly enough that only Dorothy could hear. "I want to hire her to cook for me." Dorothy raised an eyebrow. "How many cooks do you already have, Mr. Marchetti?" Elias looked at her and replied, "Enough to feed an entire building, but I haven't been able to swallow anything they've made in 3 years." The room remained silent. Dorothy stood motionless for a long time. At last, she stepped aside, not to let him pass, but to point toward the stairs. She was folding blankets upstairs, one hand still wrapped in a bandage because, on the day of the cleanup, she had tried to pull the pot out of a garbage bin and cut herself on a piece of metal. When she turned and saw him standing at the top of the stairs, she showed no surprise. She simply set down the blanket she had been folding and waited. Elias spoke briefly, without circling around the matter, and he didn't mention any numbers until he had finished saying what needed to be said. He wanted to hire her to cook breakfast at his house. The salary he offered made her ask him to repeat it, just to be certain. Then he added that he would arrange an apartment for her, one with an address, a lease, and her name on the paperwork. She remained silent for a long time, then shook her head. "I don't accept anything I haven't earned," she said. "That is the only thing I have left, sir. You can keep your apartment." Elias wasn't accustomed to being refused, but strangely, he felt no irritation. What he felt was something else, something closer to respect, and that unsettled him more than the refusal itself. Dorothy had been standing at the foot of the stairs the entire time. She came up, took the woman by the elbow, and led her to the corner of the room beside a window overlooking the street. Then she lowered her voice until it was barely more than a whisper. "Listen to one thing I have to say, and after that, you can decide whatever you want." The woman looked up. Dorothy met her eyes and said, "That little girl doesn't need your self-respect. She needs an address." The woman stood there, and her entire face changed. Not the way a person's face changes when they begin to cry, but the way a wall changes when a very fine crack has just opened across it. Dorothy continued. She reminded her that social services had granted temporary guardianship of her daughter to Dorothy after the fire. But the state wouldn't extend the arrangement forever. She knew how many squares remained on the sheet of paper, taped to the tent wall, each square representing a day left in her fight to prove she could provide a stable environment. What the court needed to see wasn't a fortune, but a legal address and a steady income to reunite mother and child officially. The woman turned away and looked down at the street for a long time. Then, she walked back to Elias, and her voice had changed. It was slower now, steadier, the voice of someone who had just decided to trade something away. "I have 4 conditions," she said. Elias nodded and told her to continue. First, she would pay the rent herself from her own wages. He could serve as guarantor for the paperwork, but he wasn't allowed to pay a single dollar on her behalf. Second, she would continue cooking on the street for the same people every weekend, and he wasn't to interfere with that. Third, she could leave the job whenever she wished, without notice and without giving a reason. Elias agreed to all 3 without having to think. Then she paused, and the 4th condition came more slowly, as though even she wasn't certain she had the right to demand it. "At some point," she said, "you have to tell me why it was me. Not because you're kind, and not because you pity people. I want the real reason, because I know there is one, and I don't want to spend months working in your house while having to guess." In that room, filled with the smell of laundered blankets and cold coffee, Elias Marchetti looked at the small woman with the bandaged hand and realized that she had just demanded from him something he had never given anyone. "All right," he said, "but not today." "Then tell me whenever you're ready," she replied. "I know how to wait." 3 days later, Warren placed a thin file on his employer's desk. He didn't ask permission, and Elias didn't ask where it had come from. The old driver said he hadn't conducted an investigation. He had merely done what anyone in that house was required to do before allowing a stranger into the kitchen. The record was clean, so clean there was nothing to say. No criminal record, no debts, no loans, not one instance of her name being entered anywhere, not even a parking ticket, the correct birth date, the correct place of issuance on her documents, every detail exactly as it should be. Warren stood there, unable to explain the feeling inside him, because in all his years of working in that world, he had never encountered a person who had lived to that age without leaving so much as a scratch on paper. "Everyone has at least one mark," he said. "She doesn't have any." Elias closed the file and pushed it aside. "Then that's good," he said. But Warren remained beside the desk for another moment, and the uneasiness within him didn't fade. On the first morning, Warren brought her in through the side entrance, led her down the long corridor to the kitchen, then left her there alone. The kitchen was so large that even her footsteps made a faint echo. A row of gleaming steel ranges ran along one wall, and in the center of the room stood a wooden table, large enough for 4 people to work around it without touching one another. She stood in the middle of that warm kitchen, carrying only a small bundle of clean clothes. The faded yellow bag, her only painful link to the fire 3 years ago, remained safely tucked away inside a locked cabinet at Dorothy's shelter, holding her tin box within it. She would never carry that scorched memory into another person's home. She reached out and touched the wooden surface. It was dry. That was the first thing she noticed. The table was dry. The floor was dry. The apron she wore was dry. And above her head was a ceiling instead of a sheet of tarp. For 3 years, she had cooked in the rain, cooked in the wind, cooked with hands so numb that she had to breathe warmth into them before she could grip the handle of a knife, cooked while keeping one eye on the flame in case a gust blew it out. Those 3 years gathered together and came down upon her all at once in that warm kitchen, and she began to cry before she could stop herself. She stood there crying for several minutes, both hands braced against the table, her shoulders trembling without a sound. Then she wiped her face with the cuff of her sleeve, tied back her hair, fastened the yellow apron around herself, and began to work. She cooked exactly what she had always cooked. Chicken broth simmered slowly. The foam skimmed away 3 times, with very little seasoning added. The tiny pasta, shaped like stars, went in last, when the broth had reached a gentle simmer rather than a rolling boil. 2 kitchen assistants stood pressed into a corner watching her work, guarded at first, then curious, because they realized that this woman was making a dish anyone could make. The only difference was that she performed every step a little more slowly than necessary, as though each movement had a reason of its own. Just before taking the pot off the heat, she reached for the jar of dried oregano on the shelf. She didn't measure it with a spoon. She pinched a small amount between 3 fingertips, dropped it into her left palm, then cupped her right hand over it, and rubbed her palms together in slow circles, 3 times, until the leaves crumbled, and their sweet, pungent fragrance rose between her hands. Then she opened them directly over the mouth of the pot and let the fragments fall. She made the gesture like someone offering a blessing, so naturally that even she didn't realize she was doing it. One of the two assistants started to say something, perhaps that it was no different from pouring the oregano straight from the jar, but then thought better of it. She carried the bowl upstairs. Ilias was seated at the small table beside the window instead of the long dining table, and he asked no questions. He picked up the spoon and raised it to his mouth, and when the first spoonful touched his tongue, he closed his eyes. He didn't close them like a man savoring food. He closed them like someone who had finally been allowed to sit down after being forced to stand for far too long. Both his hands rested on either side of the bowl, and that large man remained motionless for several seconds. His throat moved once. Then he opened his eyes and continued eating, without speaking a single word from beginning to end. The two kitchen assistants stood in the doorway and looked at each other. They had worked in that house long enough to know what was ordinary and what wasn't, and both understood that what they had just witnessed was something that must never be repeated outside those walls. Neither dared to speak. They quietly withdrew into the kitchen, and the only sound left was the spoon touching the side of the bowl. The dinner had been arranged before the first bowl of soup, and there was no way to postpone it without having the delay interpreted as an admission. The other family had reserved the entire upper floor of a restaurant by the harbor, with 2 rows of tables joined together to form one long table. When Elias entered, more than 20 men were already seated. They all rose, then sat down again in the proper order without anyone needing to remind them. He took his place at the head of the table. The food was brought in, and according to a custom that had existed since his father's time, no one was permitted to touch his fork until the man at the head of the table had touched his own. Elias knew from the moment he smelled the food that he wouldn't be able to swallow it. He knew that if he picked up his fork and raised it to his mouth, his body would betray him in front of more than 20 men, over half of whom were waiting for exactly that. So he didn't pick up the fork. He placed both hands on the table, asked the head of the other family about the warehouse at the end of the pier, and began to talk. The other man answered. Then someone else joined the conversation. The subject shifted to harbor fees, to a mutual acquaintance who had recently died, to how the weather that year was colder than usual. No one ate. Steam rose from the food until it no longer did. The fat on the surface of the sauce began to congeal into a thin skin, and the bread grew cold and hard in its basket. One man glanced down at his plate, then looked up again. Another swallowed. At the far end of the table, a young man reached for a piece of bread, but the man beside him lightly touched his wrist, and the hand withdrew. Elias kept talking. He spoke slowly, his voice even and unbroken, never once lowering his eyes to his plate. With every passing minute, the silence around that long table grew heavier, until more than 20 men sat starving in a room filled with food, and not one of them dared to be the first to break the custom. That was when Elias understood that he could turn the very thing killing him into a weapon. He didn't need to eat. He only needed to make everyone else afraid to eat. The head of the other family began to perspire along his hairline. He laughed and said the food was getting cold, then offered to have it reheated. Elias replied that they were in the middle of a discussion, and reheating the food would break its flow. The other man fell silent, but halfway down the table sat a man with snow-white hair, one of those who held a leading seat at the council table, the same elder who always spoke to Elias with practiced, paternal warmth. He set down his napkin and addressed the room in that same honeyed tone. "Young master, I've been sitting at dinners like this since your father was alive. I've never seen anyone allow a table of food to go cold for so long." Then he added that people had been telling many stories lately, and every one of those stories began with the fact that no one could remember the last time they had seen the young master eat. The entire room went still. Elias didn't answer at once. He looked at the white-haired man long enough for everyone else to understand that the question had just crossed some unseen boundary. Then he lifted his glass of water, took a sip, set it down, and said he found it strange that anyone should be more concerned about his stomach than about how much had gone missing from the warehouse at the end of the pier the previous month. The white-haired man smiled and said he had only asked out of concern. "I know," Elias said. Then he picked up his fork. Everyone at the table held their breath. He pierced a piece of food, raised it about a handspan above the plate, and held it there while finishing a sentence about the warehouse. Then he lowered it and said that he had business requiring him to leave early. He stood. More than 20 men rose with him. Not one of them ate a single bite that evening. And on the way out to the car, Warren saw his employer's hand tremble very slightly as he raised it to adjust his collar. The council meeting took place at the end of the following week, in a room with an oval table and 12 chairs with tall backs. Elias arrived precisely on time, took his seat, opened the papers before him, and began speaking about the harbor. The white-haired man's chair remained in its usual place, pushed close to the table, with no one sitting in it. No one asked. The next morning, he came down to the kitchen earlier than usual, and she knew at once that something was wrong. He sat at the small table beside the window, but this time he didn't open a file, didn't look at his telephone, and simply sat there staring at his hands resting on the table. She carried the bowl over, set it down, and was about to turn away when he called her back. "Sit down," he said. She wiped her hands on her apron and took the chair across from him, but he didn't begin eating right away. "Do you remember your fourth condition?" he asked. She said she did. He nodded, then told her he still couldn't give her the entire answer, but he could give her half of it, and that half would be enough for her to understand why he had made her sign the agreement on her first day. Then he told her. He said that for 3 years, he hadn't been able to swallow anything cooked by another person's hands. It wasn't that he disliked the food, and it wasn't that he was particular about what he ate. His body simply closed itself off, his throat closed, and everything stopped there. He had seen doctors. Some said it was neurological, some said it was psychological, some prescribed medication, and others told him he needed time. For all those months, he had survived on plain rice porridge and boiled eggs he prepared himself, and every week his shirts grew a little looser. She listened in silence. She didn't interrupt him or show him pity, and he was grateful to her for that. Then he told her the part that was harder to say. He explained that in his world, a man's strength wasn't measured by how many people served beneath him or how much money he had in the bank. It was measured at the dining table. Who sat at the head, who sat at the far end, who was served wine first, who dared to lift his fork before anyone else. Every agreement in that city was made around a dining table, and a man who couldn't eat was a man who couldn't hold a place at that table. If the council found out, they wouldn't need to prove that he had done anything wrong. They would only have to say that he was no longer strong enough, and that would be the end of it. "Does anyone know yet?" she asked. "Warren knows," he said. "Now you know." She looked down at the bowl of soup slowly growing cold between them, then raised her eyes and asked him a question no one in his life had ever asked. "Are you afraid of losing that seat, or are you afraid of people seeing that you're weak?" Elias didn't answer. He remained motionless, and the silence stretched so long that she began to think she had crossed a line. Outside the window, a car passed. Then its sound faded completely. He looked at her for a long time, and she realized that this man had never before been required to answer a question for which he hadn't prepared a response. At last, he spoke, his voice rougher than usual, and said that he had grown up in a house where weakness was a crime. Not a crime against the law, a crime against the people who sat at the same table. He said that from the time he was a boy, his father had taught him that other people only needed to smell weakness on him once, and he had spent his entire life making certain that scent was never there. Then he spoke the final words. "I don't know how to answer you, because to me, those two things are the same thing." She sat there thinking that it was the saddest thing she had ever heard a man say about himself. She didn't say it aloud. She only pushed the bowl a little closer to him and told him to eat before it grew cold. Elias picked up the spoon and finished every last drop, and all the while, she remained seated across from him with her hands resting in her lap, looking out the window so that he wouldn't have to be watched. On Sunday, she woke while it was still dark, though there was nothing she needed to do in a hurry. She pressed the only sweater she owned that was still in good condition, brushed her hair more carefully than usual, and on the way to the bus stop, she stopped at a small bakery to buy 2 milk buns that were still warm. She wrapped them in paper and held them against her chest so they wouldn't grow cold. Dorothy's home was on the 2nd floor of a red brick building 2 blocks from the shelter, with concrete steps and a potted plastic plant beside the door. Before she could press the bell, the door flew open, and something very small rushed out and wrapped itself around her legs. "Mommy, I knew you were coming." The little girl was 7 years old. She wore a blue sweater with a rabbit on the chest. Her hair was tied into 2 sections with yellow bands, and her cheeks were flushed pink from the heat inside the apartment. She took her mother's hand and pulled her inside, talking so quickly she could barely breathe. She said they had drawing class at school that week, that the teacher had asked everyone to draw their favorite place, that one child had drawn a park, and another had drawn a swimming pool. But she had drawn this. She ran into the next room, returned with a large sheet of paper, and held it up with both hands. On the paper was a kitchen. There was a large red pot, with steam rising from it in tightly curling lines, and a woman with her hair tied high, wearing a yellow apron and holding a ladle. In the lower right corner, the teacher had attached a silver paper star. The teacher said it was the best one in the whole class, the little girl said. She also asked who cooks the best food at home, and I told her my mommy does. The woman took the drawing and had to lower her head, pretending to study it carefully, because if she looked up at that moment, the child would see her eyes. Dorothy came out of the kitchen carrying a tray and told her to eat breakfast before showing off anything else, and the three of them sat down at the round table beside the window. The little girl finished an entire milk bun and went on talking. She said she had a best friend named Marisol who sat beside her, that the whole class had gone to the library the previous Friday, and that Dorothy had taught her to fold blankets military style, though she could now fold them better than Dorothy could. Dorothy told her not to make things up. The little girl collapsed into laughter. The whole morning passed that way, filled with the laughter of a 7-year-old child who had enough to eat and all the love she needed, while the woman sat drinking tea and watching her daughter, trying to memorize every detail so she could carry it back with her. Near noon, the little girl climbed into her lap and asked whether her mother would come to her birthday that year. The woman held her and said that not only would she come, but this year she would cook for her with her own hands. "Where will you cook?" the child asked. "In a real kitchen," she said. "One with a roof, a wooden table, and a fire that never goes out." The little girl cried out with delight and said she wanted the star dish, the one with the tiny pasta shaped like stars. The woman said yes and promised. The child held out her little finger, and the woman hooked her own around it. When it was time for her to leave, Dorothy walked her all the way down to the foot of the stairs and quietly told her that they were still waiting on the paperwork. Nothing had been completed yet, but there was no bad news either. So for now, they would keep going as they were. The woman nodded. On the bus ride back, she sat in the last row beside a window fogged with condensation, holding the drawing against her chest with both hands, exactly as the little girl had held it up for her. The bus passed row after row of gray streets beneath a February afternoon. People boarded and got off. No one looked at her. She remained there, clutching the sheet of paper with its red kitchen and the silver star in the corner, until the bus reached her stop. Only then did she wipe her face, rise, and step off. She found it on a Wednesday morning while searching the bottom drawer of the wooden kitchen cabinet for a vegetable peeler. The cloth cover of the notebook was worn at the corners. Its pages had yellowed, and inside were lines of slanting handwriting left by a woman in faded blue ink. She turned through several pages. They were all recipes. Every dish was written down clearly, not in the manner of a cookbook, but in the way people wrote instructions for themselves. Add a little more of this if the weather is cold. Don't hurry. The boy likes less salt. She stood there reading for a long time and forgot all about the peeler. Then she came to a page containing a recipe for beans with pasta, the kind of poor family's meal people made in winter, and she decided to prepare it. She followed every line exactly. She soaked the beans overnight, cooked the onions in olive oil until fragrant, and added a cheese rind to the pot so it would sweeten the broth. Near the bottom of the recipe was a note, reminding her to crush the leaves in her palm rather than dropping them in whole, because leaving them whole took away their fragrance. She read that line, and her hand paused over the page for a moment. Then she followed the instruction, just as she always did, just as she had done 1,000 times before. The pot began to simmer, and the fragrance spread through the entire kitchen. The scent of onions browned at the edges, and cheese rind dissolving into broth, the smell of a home in winter. Elias was passing through the corridor when he stopped. He stood in the kitchen doorway with one hand still resting on the frame, and when she looked up, she saw that his face had gone deathly pale. Then he collapsed onto the threshold itself, sitting flat on the kitchen floor with his back against the wooden frame, that tall man in his tailored suit sinking down like someone whose bones had suddenly been taken from him. She started toward him, but he raised a hand to stop her. He sat there breathing for a while. Then, in a very quiet voice, he said that his mother used to make this dish, and he told her. He said there had been a reconciliation dinner between two families on the other side of the harbor, a dinner that had taken months to arrange in the hope of ending something that had gone on for far too long. His mother had sat to his left. She was wearing dark blue. Throughout the meal, he hadn't touched his plate because he was too busy talking, and she kept glancing at him in the way a mother looked at a son well into his 30s, who still refused to eat properly. Then she switched their plates. She did it so naturally, continuing her conversation with the person beside her, as she exchanged her plate for his, just as she had done since he was a boy. He couldn't even remember whether he had thanked her. Half an hour later, she said she felt unwell. Then she could no longer stand. People called for a car, shouted, and scattered in every direction around that long table. He knelt and caught her in his arms, and she died there while the pristine linen before them remained unstained, without a single drop upon it. He fell silent for a long time. Then he asked her to give him the notebook. She handed it to him. He turned to the final page, one she hadn't yet reached, and there, beneath the recipes, were several lines written in his mother's familiar, warm ink, dated months before that tragic night. He read the words aloud, his voice barely a whisper. His mother had written about a quiet sanctuary she found at a 12-seat diner, praising the gentle young woman with the scarred hand who cooked with genuine heart. She had noted that if Elias ever lost his way or missed the taste of home, he should seek out that small kitchen. Elias closed the notebook and said that he had searched for her. He had sent people to the diner itself, but when he arrived at the diner the very next morning, the place had already been burned to the ground, and he was told that the young woman who worked in the kitchen had died in the flames, her body burned beyond recognition. He said that for 3 years, he had been searching for a ghost, and that was why he kept telling Warren to drive through that neighborhood once every week, though even he couldn't explain why. She stood beside the stove. The pot of beans continued to simmer behind her. Both her hands were still dusted with the flour she had just scraped from the side of the mixing bowl, and she didn't wipe them, didn't move, and didn't say a word. The man's name was Rusk. He had worked for the family since he was young, overseeing the harbor ledgers, and it took Warren less than a week to discover that the figures from the warehouse at the end of the pier had already made their way to the other side before they were ever entered into the books. Elias didn't summon him to the meeting room. He told Warren to drive to the man's house early one morning, and he sat in Rusk's kitchen with the coffee Rusk's wife had prepared, resting untouched before him, while the man stood there with his hands trembling violently. Elias placed a thick envelope and an airline ticket on the table. He said the flight would depart that afternoon, that he had arranged for accommodations at the other end, and that the money in the envelope was enough for a family to begin again somewhere warmer than Boston. Rusk didn't understand. He simply stood there waiting for something worse to happen. Elias drained the cup of coffee, rose, fastened the button of his jacket, and paused beside the man on his way to the door. "Your mother still lives on Hanover Street, doesn't she?" he asked. Rusk nodded. "The old woman will be left in peace," Elias said, his voice as calm as though he were discussing the weather, "as long as you don't come back." Then he walked out to the car. Warren opened the door for his employer, and in that moment, the old driver realized that he had just witnessed something more dreadful than any beating he had ever seen in his life. That afternoon, Rusk boarded a plane with his wife and never returned to the city. 3 days later, the Ashford family came to visit. Sterling Ashford had held a leading seat at the council table longer than anyone else. His hair was combed straight back, his shirt cuffs always extended exactly 1 centimeter beyond the sleeves of his jacket, and he arrived carrying a file concerning a marriage agreement, the union of the two families, and the future. Elias received him in the grand sitting room. The conversation was proceeding normally when the door opened, and she entered carrying a tray of drinks. She set a glass before Sterling. He reached for it, and the glass fell. It dropped directly onto the glass tabletop and shattered, splashing water across his sleeve. For the next 2 seconds, Sterling Ashford sat utterly still, his face drained white, his eyes fixed on her as though he were staring at something that had no right to be there. She stepped back, apologized, and bent down to gather the broken pieces. Sterling gave a sudden laugh and said his hands had begun to tremble lately, that it came with age. Elias looked at him, then at her, and he didn't understand what had just happened. He merely remembered it. Late the following afternoon, Camille Ashford arrived alone. She went directly to the kitchen without having anyone announce her, placed one hand against the wooden table, and looked the woman over from head to toe. She said she meant no harm and had only come to make something clear. There were places in life that, once a person wandered into them, were best left as quickly as possible. The woman wiped her hands and said that she only cooked. Camille smiled and said everyone believed they were merely doing something ordinary, until they discovered they were standing in the middle of something that wasn't ordinary at all. Then she added that the house was in mourning, and when a household grieved, People could easily cling to anyone who brought them a little warmth. That wasn't good for anyone. The woman said she understood. Camille straightened, adjusted her sleeve, and at the kitchen door, she turned back to offer one final remark. Her voice was as gentle as sincere advice. She told the woman not to let herself become entangled in what had happened that night, because that night was still bringing misery to many people, including those whose only part had been standing at the gate and signing for a delivery. Then, she left. The sound of her high heels slowly faded along the corridor. In the kitchen, the woman stood motionless with the dish towel still in her hand, her eyes fixed on some distant point upon the wooden table. She remained that way for a long time. Then she set the towel down, walked to the sink, turned on the faucet, and let the water run over both hands until the cold made them numb. That evening, she didn't return to her new apartment. She carried her pot to the row of tents that had been rebuilt on the empty lot behind the shelter, where the people driven from beneath the overpass had gathered again over the past several weeks, and she cooked as she did every Tuesday night. The line had just dispersed when headlights shone into the lot from the mouth of the alley. 2 cars stopped with their engines off and their lights still burning. 4 men stepped out, dressed in long coats, walking slowly and without haste, with the stride of men who knew they would never need to run. The man in front called her name, not the name she had been using. He called her something else, the way someone might call an object, and said that someone wanted to speak with her. Only speak with her. He invited her to get into the car. She stepped back, then she turned and ran. She ran along the row of tents between 2 lines of stretched tarps, her feet striking the frozen ground, with the footsteps behind her drawing very close. But when she reached the open space in the center, she saw someone step out. The old man in the threadbare knit cap, the one who always stood first in line each evening, emerged from his tent and planted himself directly in the middle of the path. Then another person came out. Then 2 more from the other side. Then an entire row of them. They said nothing, raised no cries, and none of them held anything in their hands. They simply left their tents and formed a line across the path, shoulder to shoulder, blocking it completely. Thin people in every kind of old coat, no 2 alike, standing between her and the 4 men. Dorothy Wade came down from the shelter, her slightly uneven footsteps distinct in the night, and walked straight to the head of the line. She stopped in the exact center, empty-handed, her back straight. She said this was city property, and everyone had the right to stand there, including them. But if they wanted to pass, she said, they would have to go through every person one by one. The man in front told her to move. She didn't. He stepped forward and reached out to push her aside, and in that instant, the entire line moved forward 1 step together. No one gave a signal. No one counted. They simply stepped forward, and the sound of their feet striking the frozen ground rang out as one. What followed was brief and chaotic. There was the sound of coats rubbing together, the noise of someone falling against the side of a tent and making the entire tarp shudder, a voice shouting for someone to step back, and the metallic clatter of a saucepan hitting the ground. The 4 men hadn't expected this. They had been sent to put 1 woman into a car, not to stand in the middle of a crowd that kept growing as more people emerged from the tents. Then headlights swept across the entrance to the lot. A black car surged into the alley and braked sharply, flooding the entire open space with 2 beams of white light. Elias stepped out. He didn't run. He walked between the 2 rows of people, and the homeless men and women moved aside to let him pass. He went directly to the 4 men. He didn't raise his voice. He merely asked who had sent them, and not one of the 4 could answer. Then he told them to get into their cars, go home, and tell whoever had sent them that Elias had been there that night. The 4 men looked at one another. They backed away, climbed into their cars, and the 2 vehicles turned around and disappeared down the alley. When the sound of their engines had completely faded, the empty lot sank back into darkness, with only the headlights of Elias's car shining across the tarps. She was still standing in the same place. Dorothy walked over to her and reached up to straighten the collar that had been knocked askew, adjusting it as though she were tending to a child. Then she turned to the people still standing there and told them to go back inside their tents before they grew cold. They slowly dispersed, and no one spoke about what had just happened. The old man in the threadbare knit cap passed by her, stopped, picked up the fallen saucepan, handed it to her, then returned to his tent. Elias stood watching him go, and he thought that throughout his life he had bought the loyalty of many people, yet never once had he managed to buy what had just happened in that empty lot. The next morning, She arrived before her shift began, and when Elias came down to the kitchen, she was already standing there. She wasn't cooking anything. Both hands rested on the back of a chair. She told him there was something she needed to say, and that once she had finished, he could send her away whenever he wished. He sat down. She began with the diner. It was called the Copper Spoon, and it stood on the corner of a narrow street. It had 12 seats and a kitchen so cramped that 2 people couldn't pass each other without turning sideways. She had worked there for 2 years, starting when her daughter was just 2. Then she told him about an older woman who often came in alone during the middle of the afternoon, when the diner was quiet. She always sat at the table farthest inside and always ordered the simplest dishes on the menu. She never said who she was. She only liked to come into the kitchen and talk, praising one thing and criticizing another. Once, she had even told the woman that leaving the herbs whole was a waste. She needed to crush them in her palm so their fragrance could rise. The woman stopped. Elias didn't move. Then she continued. One day, the older woman placed a special order for an appetizer to be served at a large dinner. She said the evening was very important, and she wanted one of the dishes to be prepared by someone she trusted. The woman spent the entire afternoon cooking it. That evening, she carried it across the harbor, delivered it to the gate of the mansion, signed a ledger the guard held out to her, then took the bus home. She never went inside. She didn't know who ate it. She didn't know what happened afterward. Only hours after that fateful dinner, before dawn could break, the diner burned to the ground. She told that part in a flat, even voice, as though reciting something she had long ago memorized. That night, she had gone outside to take out the garbage. That was all. The back alley, 2 bins, only a few minutes. When she returned, smoke was already pouring through the gap around the kitchen door, thick and black, and she couldn't get back inside. Sirens were wailing at the end of the street. Someone pulled her away. She stood across the street all night, and she saw him run out. He made it all the way to the sidewalk. She could see his face clearly beneath the lights. Then he turned and looked at her once, before running back inside. She didn't understand why. She hadn't understood for 3 years. He was the man she was going to marry, the father of their daughter, who was only 4 years old at the time, and being cared for by a neighbor while they worked double shifts to buy a future. He had already escaped, but he turned back to save what he thought was her trapped inside. Then she told Elias the final part. The list of those who died contained 2 names. One was his. The second was recorded as an unidentified female kitchen employee. She stood across the street, knowing her young child was temporarily taken in by Dorothy under shelter protective care, and listened as someone read that list. She didn't cross over. She said the police were asking questions about the gas stove, that the diner's owner had told the insurance company the fire was her fault, and that she had no documents, no place to live, and no one to call. She said she had stood there thinking that if people believed she was dead, they would stop looking for her, so she let them believe it. She walked away, and for 3 years, she had lived under a name that wasn't her own. When she finished, she fell silent. The only sound in the kitchen was the hum of the refrigerator. Elias remained seated for a long time. He looked down at the wooden table, his hands resting on either side, neither clenched nor moving. There was nothing on his face, no anger, no pain, no expression she could read. She had prepared herself for him to shout. She had prepared herself for him to summon someone. She had even prepared herself for him to ask whether she knew whose final meal she had cooked. But he did none of those things. He sat there in silence for so long that she began to hear her own heart beating. Then he stood. He slowly fastened the button of his jacket, the same gesture she had seen him make dozens of times before every meeting, and he didn't look at her. He passed close enough for her to smell the fabric of his suit, then continued toward the door. She called his name once. He didn't stop. The kitchen door closed behind him, neither hard nor softly. It simply closed, and his footsteps slowly faded along the stone corridor until she could no longer hear them. He didn't leave his study for the rest of that day or the entire night that followed. He had everything still preserved from 3 years earlier brought upstairs, every document he had once read and then put away because reading it again would serve no purpose, and he spread it all across the floor. The guest list, the seating chart, the wine invoices, the staff assignment sheet, the police report, photographs of the dining room after everyone had left. In his wrinkled shirt, he crawled across the floor among those papers and read every line again through the eyes of a man who had just been told that he had been searching in the wrong place from the very beginning. He wasn't looking for the person who had put that substance into the food. He was looking for the thread. He was trying to discover how his mother, a woman who had eaten at only 3 or 4 familiar places throughout her life, had learned about a diner with 12 seats on a street her car had never once traveled. He searched through the night. Near dawn, he pulled out the old household expense ledgers, the kind that recorded small, insignificant purchases no one ever bothered to examine. He worked backward through them, month by month, until he stopped at a single entry, a small charge, with a date, the name of the diner, and a note stating that it had been lunch for the mistress of the house. In the final column, the one identifying the person who had accompanied her, was a signature so familiar that Elias had seen it his entire life, without ever truly looking at it. He lowered himself onto the floor with the ledger resting on his lap. Daylight slowly gathered beyond the window. At 7 o'clock, he summoned Warren. The old driver entered and knew at once when he saw the papers spread across the floor. He asked no questions. He simply stood there with his hands clasped behind his back, in the same posture he had assumed in that room for so many years. Elias raised the ledger and read the entry aloud, slowly, one word at a time. Then he asked, "Was it you?" Warren said it was. Elias asked how many times he had taken her there. Warren said several times, and that the first time had been his idea. "She told me she wanted to eat somewhere no one knew who she was." Elias rose to his feet. He asked Warren how long he had known. Warren didn't answer immediately. Then he spoke the final words, and he said them very quietly. "Since the night she died, young master." The room became utterly still. Elias stood there, and in a single instant, he understood everything. For 3 years, this man had remained beside him, had driven him down that very street once every week, had listened as he spoke about searching for a girl who was dead, and had kept silent, not because of betrayal, not because of money. He had remained silent because if he spoke, that thread would lead directly back to him, and the first person Elias Marchetti would be forced to deal with would be the man who had held him when he was only 3 days old. Warren offered no defense. He didn't say that he had done it out of concern for the family. He didn't say he had feared a war. He didn't say what he had considered during all those nights. He merely stood there and accepted what was coming. Elias walked around the desk. He reached into his jacket and took out the ring of car keys. Warren had returned to him every evening for more than 20 years, then received back again every morning, and set it on the desk. The sound of metal striking wood rang dryly through the room. "Go," he said. Warren looked at the keys. Then he raised his eyes to his employer one final time, and in the eyes of that man in his 60s, there wasn't a trace of resentment. There was only something close to the relief of a man who was finally being allowed to repay a debt he had carried for far too long. He said nothing more. He gave a single nod, turned, and walked out. Elias remained alone in the room, flooded with papers, and it was a very long time before he realized that he was still standing in the same place, one hand resting lightly on the desk beside the ring of keys no one had picked up. She arrived the next morning as she did every day, but she didn't cook. She stood in the middle of the kitchen for a long time, looking at the wooden table, the row of steel ranges, and the bottom drawer where she had found the notebook. Then she removed the yellow apron. She folded it in half, smoothed it flat, and draped it over the back of the chair where he sat beside the window every morning. She left no note. She had spent the entire night wondering what she could write, and she realized that anything she put on paper would become an apology. An apology wouldn't be right, because she had done nothing wrong, and it wouldn't be enough, because his mother was dead. She took only her cloth bag and left through the side entrance, the same way Warren had brought her inside on that first morning. In the kitchen, the 2 assistants looked at the apron hanging over the chair, and neither dared to touch it. Elias came down near noon. He looked at the chair. He didn't ask anyone a single question. He merely stood there for a while, then returned to his study. From that day forward, the apron remained exactly where she had left it, day after day, and no one in the house dared to move it. 3 days later, the cook tried to prepare the same dish. She had watched the woman often enough to remember every step, and she followed them with an almost heartbreaking care, even crushing the herbs in her palm, even adding the pasta when the water was gently simmering rather than boiling hard. Elias picked up the spoon. He filled it. He raised it to his mouth. And his throat closed exactly as it had before, exactly as it had 3 years earlier, exactly as it did every time. He set the spoon down very gently and thanked her. That night, he prepared a pot of plain rice porridge for himself, the food that had sustained him through all those months, the one thing his body had never refused. He ladled some into a bowl, sat down at the kitchen table, and managed to swallow 3 spoonfuls. The 4th wouldn't go down. He remained there for a long time with the bowl of white porridge before him, understanding that the door had closed once again. This time, it had shut more tightly than before, and this time, there was nowhere left for him to retreat. He told no one. He continued to rise at the proper hour, shave, knot his tie, sit at the meeting table, and speak about the harbor and contracts in the same even voice that never changed. But the drawer on the right side of his desk, which had once held only pens and several seals, now contained blister packs of medication. Pills to help him sleep, pills to calm his stomach, mineral supplements for dehydration. Some packs were empty, some were new, stacked without any order, and whenever he opened that drawer, he closed it quickly, as though shutting away something that didn't belong to him. The council met at the end of that week. Sterling Ashford sat in his usual place, and he didn't say directly what he had come to say. He began by expressing concern. He said the family was entering an important period, that people on the other side of the harbor were watching, and that rumors, if they weren't put down, would grow on their own. Then he said that perhaps the time had come for the council to reconsider who should sit at the head of the table. 10 heads turned toward Elias. Elias didn't rise. He asked Sterling what reason he intended to give. Sterling smiled and said no one needed a reason when everyone could see the same thing. One man proposed holding the vote that day. Another said they should wait. In the end, the council agreed to delay the matter for 7 days, so everything could be considered with proper decorum, the way people spoke in rooms like that, when everyone already knew the outcome, but still wanted to preserve appearances. Elias nodded, closed the file before him, and left. He drove himself home because there was no one left to drive for him, and he moved more slowly than necessary along the street where the diner had burned to the ground. Then he returned to the house, opened the kitchen door, turned on the light, and stood looking at the yellow apron draped over the back of the chair. Warren found her at an all-night diner near the bus terminal, a place that paid cash at the end of each shift, and asked no one for documents. He stood outside the kitchen window for a long time, watching her at the sink with both arms submerged in soapy water and her hair clinging to her forehead from the heat. Then he waited until she came outside to rest on the back steps. He sat beside her without offering a greeting and placed a cloth-bound notebook with worn corners on the stretch of concrete between them. She looked at it but didn't reach for it. He said he hadn't come to ask her to return, and that he no longer had the right to tell anyone what to do. He told her she owed the young master nothing. She owed him nothing. She owed that house nothing. But then he said there was one person she did owe, and that person was herself. For 3 years, you've lived with the question of why he went back inside after he had already escaped, Warren said. You'll carry that question to your grave unless you search for the answer. She remained silent. Water dripped from the edge of the small awning onto the steps. Then she picked up the notebook. He drove her back to the mansion near dawn, while the rest of the house was still asleep, and opened the side door with a spare set of keys he had kept for more than 20 years, keys no one had thought to ask him to return. He led her upstairs to the study she had never entered. He switched on the light. On the wall at the far end of the room, what she had always assumed was a board for work turned out to be covered with pinned documents and photographs. There was a seating chart. There was a list of names. There were 3 photographs numbered in red marker. The first showed a man in middle age. The second showed a server. The third was an image taken by the security camera at the gate, captured at night from a steep angle behind the visitor. It showed only the silhouette of a woman in a dark coat, her face completely turned away from the lens, but her shoulder carried a faded yellow cloth bag with a distinct scorched strap. Elias had searched for that bag for 3 long years. The woman's eyes then shifted to the table beside Warren, where her belongings lay exposed, and right on top was her very same yellow bag. When Warren had stopped by the shelter earlier, Dorothy had quietly entrusted him with the key to the tin box, believing it was finally time for the truth to come to light. In that single, shattering moment, she realized with a gasp how close he had been to the truth all along. Beneath the photograph, written in Elias's neat handwriting, were 3 words. Suspect, number 3. She stood before that wall, her breath catching in her throat. He had passed her every morning on his way out of the room, had sat working with his back to her, and had searched throughout the city for her while she remained there, pinned to the wall less than 3 paces from his desk. The door opened behind her. Elias stood on the threshold, in a shirt that wasn't fully buttoned, his hair disordered, and he saw her standing before the board, with her arms hanging at her sides. He looked at her, then he looked at the photograph. Then he lowered his eyes toward the back of the chair beside the downstairs window, something he couldn't see from where he stood, though he knew exactly what was draped over it. No one spoke. No one stepped forward. 3 people stood in that room beneath the yellowed glow of the desk lamp, and the silence lasted so long that they could hear the clock on the wall. That same morning, on the other side of the city, Camille Ashford waited for Warren outside the small apartment he had recently moved into. She didn't circle around the matter. She asked him who had decided the menu on the night of the dinner. Warren looked at her. He didn't answer. He merely stood there with the ring of keys in his hand and remained silent, and the silence lasted just long enough for Camille to understand that he didn't need to say anything. Her face went pale. She turned and hurried to her car, her hand trembling so badly that it took her 2 attempts to fit the key into the ignition. That afternoon, Warren placed a telephone call to a nursing home on the north side of the city. Hector Alvarez, an old man who had once worked as a kitchen assistant at the Copper Spoon, sat in the common room and spoke over the telephone in the trembling voice of someone who had held on to something for far too long. He said that he had gone outside to smoke that night. He said he hadn't dared tell anyone for 3 years. Then he said that the laundromat across from the diner had a security camera, that the owner was a friend of his, and that the machine had been running all night. The laundromat stood diagonally across the street from what had once been the diner. Its metal shutter was lowered halfway, and the glass was covered with dust so thick that no one could see through it. A city ceiling notice, faded by years of sun and rain, still clung to the door. The 3 of them arrived after midnight. Warren carried a flashlight. Camille Ashford stood some distance from the other 2, with her arms crossed and her face cold and expressionless. From the beginning, she made it clear that she hadn't come to help anyone. She had come to see for herself. The woman replied that she didn't need anyone's help either. Warren told them both to be quiet and let him work. He slipped one hand through the gap beneath the shutter and released the latch inside with a movement so practiced that neither woman bothered asking where he had learned it. The door lifted with a long metallic screech that echoed through the deserted street. Inside, it was completely dark and colder than it was outdoors. Industrial washing machines stood in rows with their doors hanging open, their drums filled with cobwebs. Warren directed the flashlight toward the ceiling, found the camera mounted in one corner, then followed its cable down to a wooden cabinet behind the counter. He forced the lock. Inside was an old recording unit and a disconnected hard drive wrapped in a plastic bag, placed there neatly as though someone had deliberately preserved it for another person to find. At that same moment, in the mansion across the city, Elias sat in his study without turning on the main lights. Before him lay a handwritten list and a telephone. He called each person one at a time. None of them belonged to the council. They were warehouse keepers, dock watchmen, drivers, people his father had taken under his protection when they had nothing, people whose names had never appeared in any meeting. He threatened no one. He simply said there would be a meeting at the end of the week, and that he wanted to know where each of them would stand when it was over. Some answered immediately. Some asked for one night to think. One person remained silent and ended the call. Elias crossed that name from the list and called the next one. Near dawn, the list that remained was shorter than he had expected, though not so short that there was no hope. He folded the paper and slipped it into his breast pocket. Inside the laundromat, Warren connected the hard drive to the laptop he had brought with him. The screen came to life in the darkness, casting its glow across 3 faces. The footage was black and white and heavily grained, with the camera angled toward the street, capturing the sidewalk on the opposite side and the front of the diner. Warren moved quickly through it. At first, there was only an empty street, a cat passing by, and a drunken man staggering along. Then he slowed the recording. A car approached and parked close to the curb directly in front of the diner. It was a black luxury car, and when it stopped, its license plate sat perfectly within the frame. Camille took one step forward. No one got out. The car remained there for a long time with its lights off, then drove away. Warren continued through the footage, and after a while, smoke began to appear in the frame. The woman stared at the screen, her fingers digging into the edge of the counter. She saw herself. A small figure ran out of the side alley, stopped abruptly, then backed into the middle of the street. She watched herself standing on the opposite side with both hands clasped over her head. Then the diner door burst open, and a man rushed outside. He reached the sidewalk. He straightened, turned his head as he searched, and saw her. In the recording, the two of them looked at each other across the street for exactly 2 seconds. Then he turned his back and ran inside again. Warren froze the image. The woman stood there without crying, only breathing, and whispered, "He saw me." He knew I was already outside, but he still went back in. Warren looked at her gently and explained what the police file had missed. In the panicked haze of thick smoke, her fiancé had seen a female silhouette collapsing near the kitchen door and mistakenly believed it was her. He had gone back in to save her, unaware she was already on the street. Then Warren opened a second folder on the hard drive, one the laundromat owner had copied from somewhere and stored alongside the footage. Inside were photographs of several ledger pages. It was the event booking ledger. There was a list of dishes, the names of suppliers, the dates and times of delivery, and the signature of the person who had accepted the order at the gate. On the final page was the payment invoice, clearly stating the amount and the party responsible for payment. Beneath it was a handwritten signature in black ink, its strokes slanting to the right, the final line extending into a familiar hook. Camille stared at it. She had seen that signature throughout her entire life, on school enrollment papers, on birthday cards, on everything a father signed for his daughter. She said nothing. She reached out and touched the screen, then her knees gave way, and she sank onto the cold tile floor of the abandoned laundromat among the washing machines filled with cobwebs, where she remained motionless for a very long time. After that night at the laundromat, old Hector refused to return to the nursing home. He said he had slept in unfamiliar beds for 10 years and now wanted to sleep near a kitchen, so Dorothy set up a folding cot for him in the storage room behind the shelter kitchen. On the night before the woman was due in court, she stayed there to prepare a pot of food for the following morning, then went outside and sat on the steps. Elias arrived near midnight, parked at the end of the street, and sat beside her without saying much. The two of them remained there in the cold, talking about the documents she needed to bring, about how early she should arrive, about the small and ordinary things people discussed when they were afraid to speak of the larger ones. About half an hour later, she smelled it. It wasn't the stove. It was something else, something sharper, coming from behind the building. She sprang to her feet. Around the corner, an orange glow was licking its way along the rear wall, and the window of the storage room was blazing with light. She ran. Elias called her name and ran after her. The back door was still slightly open, with thick black smoke pouring through the gap and rising in rolling waves. She covered her face with her sleeve and rushed inside. She couldn't see anything. There was only the heat striking her face and the smoke that made her throat close at once. She crouched low and followed the wall from memory, calling Hector's name with every breath remaining in her chest. Calling, then coughing, then calling again. A cough answered from the far corner. She felt her way toward it, her hand finding the edge of the folding cot, then an arm. The old man had managed to sit up, but he didn't know which way led outside. She seized his hand and pulled. They made it several steps before she ran out of breath, and then someone came rushing in behind her. Elias slipped his arms beneath Hector's shoulders and lifted him bodily, shouting for her to go first, telling her to keep moving straight ahead and not look back. The three of them spilled out onto the cold concrete just as smoke filled the entire room. She lay face down and coughed, coughing until her chest burned, coughing until the night sky above her seemed to spin. Then sirens sounded from the end of the street, and red lights began sweeping across the walls. There were running footsteps, the roar of water, and voices calling to one another. Someone draped a blanket over her shoulders. They took Hector to the ambulance, and the old man could still sit upright and speak. Before the doors closed, he even managed to grasp her hand and say, "Thank you, child." She sat down on the edge of the sidewalk. Elias sat beside her. Both were covered in grime, their faces blackened, their hair plastered to their foreheads, their hands trembling from the cold and from something else as well. Before them, smoke was still rising from the storage room, while firefighters moved through the flashing lights. She remained silent for a long time, then her shoulders began to shake. Elias turned toward her, unable to tell whether she was crying or doing something else, until she lifted her face and he saw that she was laughing. She laughed without making a sound, tears streaming down both cheeks and leaving 2 bright trails through the soot, her shoulders trembling in waves. He asked whether she was all right. She shook her head. Then, in a voice scraped raw, she said that for 3 years, she had dreamed every night that she was standing across the street. Every single night. She stood there watching that door and couldn't do anything, couldn't take even one step. And each time she woke, she found herself still standing in the same place. She said she had spent 3 years across that street. Then she stopped, drew in a trembling breath, and said, "This time, I made it inside. This time, I pulled someone out." Elias said nothing. He only reached for her hand, the hand marked by a scar that ran from its back to beyond her elbow, the hand that had passed him a bowl of soup through the open window of his car on a bitterly cold February night, and he held it in his own. She didn't pull away. They remained that way on the edge of the sidewalk, amid the rush of water and the red light sweeping back and forth across the brick walls, their two soot-covered hands clasped tightly together. Neither spoke another word until the first light of morning began to gather at the far end of the street. The courtroom was smaller than she had imagined, with only a few rows of wooden benches, a ceiling fan turning slowly, despite the fact that it was the middle of February, and the smell of old paper. Dorothy sat in the front row. On the last bench near the door, a man in a dark coat had remained silent since the proceedings began, and not one person in the room had turned to look at him. The judge reviewed the case in the even voice of someone who had read thousands of files just like it. She said the issue wasn't which person could care for the child better, because every report stated that the little girl was healthy, attended school regularly, and was being cared for attentively in Mrs. Wade's home. The problem was the birth certificate. The space for the mother's name contained nothing, only a blank. The child had been born at a charitable clinic, and the woman who registered her birth that day had used a name for which the records office could find no matching documentation. The judge looked up and said that on paper, the woman sitting before her had no legal relationship of any kind to the child. The lawyer appointed by the court said a few words about requesting more time. She listened in silence. She knew exactly what awaited her. She had spent the entire night after the fire considering it over and over again, and she knew there was only one way forward, and she knew what it would cost. If she spoke her true name, it would be entered into the court record. Court records were public documents. In this city, it would take only one afternoon for someone to discover that the woman listed as unidentified 3 years earlier was still alive, still remembered, and was still the last person to have touched the food served that night. She rose. The judge asked whether she wished to say anything. She said she did. Then she stood with both hands resting on the back of the bench before her and began by apologizing to the court, because what the judge was about to hear would make the case more complicated rather than less. She said the name on the birth certificate wasn't hers. "My name is Elena," she said softly, her voice carrying through the quiet room. "Elena Vance." She spoke it slowly, each word clear for the first time in 3 years, and in that courtroom, the scratching of the clerk's pen could be heard moving across the paper. Then she explained why. She explained that 7 years ago, when her daughter was born at a charitable clinic during a time of extreme poverty, she had been forced to use an informal alias to protect her child from her family's past troubles. But 3 years ago, after the fire, that fake identity became her only shield to stay invisible. Then she told them about the fire 3 years ago, about how her true name, Elena Vance, was placed on the list of those who hadn't survived, and how she chose to let the world believe she was dead. She said that at the time, she hadn't thought she was breaking the law. She had only believed that if people thought Elena Vance was dead, they would stop looking for her. She said she had lived under that assumed name for the past 3 years, working, sleeping, and cooking for people, and every time someone called her by it, she needed half a second to remember that they were speaking to her. The judge asked whether she understood that her testimony would lead to a separate investigation, and that it could have consequences for her. She said she understood. Then she spoke the words that everyone in that courtroom would remember for a very long time. She said, "For 3 years, an assumed alias was the only thing that kept me alive. I held on to that fake name the way someone holds on to a borrowed coat. But today, I'm giving it back. I'm shedding the disguise that protected me so I can reclaim my true name, Elena Vance, and my right to hear my daughter call me Mom. If the court forces me to choose between safety and being her mother, then I choose to be her mother, and I choose it from this moment forward." Then she sat down, and she cried. She hadn't cried in front of anyone for 3 years. She hadn't cried on the night of the fire, hadn't cried when she lost her home, hadn't cried while sitting on the bus holding the drawing with the silver star in the corner. But she cried there, seated on a wooden bench in the room with the slowly turning ceiling fan, her face buried in both hands, her shoulders trembling without a sound, while Dorothy turned and placed a hand against her back. The judge didn't strike her gavel. She allowed the moment to remain undisturbed. Then, from the last row, the man in the dark coat rose. He said nothing. He merely stood, unfastened his coat, and stepped forward so that everyone could see him. And one by one, the entire courtroom, from the judge to the clerk, turned to look. On the 7th day, the council met in the room with the oval table and 12 chairs with tall backs, and this time no one pretended it was an ordinary meeting. Sterling Ashford didn't wait for his turn. He rose the moment everyone had taken their seats, fastened the button of his jacket, and said it was time to call the situation by its proper name. He said that the man sitting at the head of the table hadn't been able to swallow a single bite of food prepared by another person's hands for 3 years. He said the entire city had sat at meals with Elias, and not one person had ever seen him eat. Then he asked the remaining 11 men whether they truly intended to entrust the harbor, the ledgers, and the future of several hundred families to a man who couldn't even sit through a meal. No one answered. Elias remained silent at the head of the table, both hands resting on the wood. Sterling said he proposed that they vote immediately. One man raised his hand. Then the door to the meeting room opened. The woman entered first, carrying a steaming pot in both hands, the yellow apron tied over her clothes. Camille Ashford followed her, holding a thick file. Sterling turned, and his entire body went rigid when he saw his daughter. The woman walked directly to the middle of the table and set the pot down before them all. Then she straightened and spoke. She said she was nobody. She cooked food. That was all. She said she had come because the people in that room were deciding whether a man was worthy, simply because his throat would no longer open. Then she asked everyone at the table a question. Had any of them ever asked why? She asked what had killed the mother who died at that dining table. Was it the food, or was it someone sitting in that room? Camille stepped forward and placed the file on the table. She opened it, turned to the final page, and didn't look at her father as she spoke. She said this was the payment invoice for the dinner that night. This was the event booking ledger. This was the footage from the camera across from the diner that had burned, and this was the signature. She said she had looked at that signature her entire life. Sterling laughed. He said his daughter hadn't been well lately. He said anyone could forge documents. He said this was a cheap performance staged by a kitchen woman and a daughter who was angry with her father. He spoke louder than necessary, and that was what made the other 11 men begin to look at him differently. Elias rose. He said nothing. He merely stood, and along both walls of the room, the men who had been leaning there since the meeting began straightened at the same moment. No one gave a signal. No one needed to. Sterling fell silent. For the next 2 seconds, no one in the room breathed. Elias looked across the table at the man with the combed-back hair, and everyone there knew exactly what was in his mind, because they had spent their entire lives in that world, and understood that some things required only a nod. They knew he was more than capable. They knew no one in that room could stop him. They knew that if he nodded, by the following morning, no one would be asking after Sterling Ashford, and no one would dare, and they waited for that nod. Elias stood there, and in those 2 seconds, he remembered the spotless white table from that night, and his mother's hand resting in his. He understood that if he nodded now, the cycle that had begun that night would never end. It would continue through him, and then through whoever came after him, forever. Then he heard someone call his name. The woman stood beside the pot and said it softly. Only once. Elias sat down. He took the telephone from his breast pocket, placed it on the table, switched on the speaker, and dialed a number. It rang 3 times. A man answered and identified himself by name and title from the office of the federal prosecutor. The entire room went dead silent. Elias said he had several documents to surrender, that he wished to request an appointment the following morning, and that he would arrive with his attorney. Then he ended the call. He looked at Sterling and said, "My mother cooked for you at my family's table for years. I'm going to let you live a very long time, and I want you to remember the smell of every meal she made." Then he reached for the ladle, filled a bowl from the pot, and ate. He ate slowly and finished the entire bowl before the remaining 11 men. The first person to rise and leave the table was the man sitting beside Sterling. Then the second. Then, one by one, all the others. Not a single vote was cast. The price came quickly after that. Nearly all the family's assets were frozen, and the empire the Marchetti family had built over 3 generations was dismantled piece by piece and transformed into several smaller companies operating legally. Elias received a suspended sentence and a long obligation to cooperate with the authorities. Warren Doyle was sentenced to 3 years in prison for concealment of evidence and failure to report a crime. He didn't appeal, didn't ask anyone to plead on his behalf, and walked through the prison gates with the same straight back he had maintained in the study for more than 20 years. Camille Ashford left Boston one spring morning and provided no forwarding address. Over the next 3 years, the ground floor of the building where the old diner had once stood was renovated and turned into a free community kitchen. 4 words were carved into the wooden sign hanging outside: the Table of Antonia. Every member of the kitchen staff had once lived on the streets and had been recruited and trained by Dorothy Wade. On opening day, each person received a name tag to wear on their chest. When it was old Hector Alvarez's turn, the woman read aloud, "This is Mr. Hector Alvarez, head of food preparation." The old man held the name tag in his hand and stood motionless. Then he began to cry. He said that for 10 years, no one had spoken his name together with a job title. People had only called him the old man, that fellow over there, or the man who sat in the corner. He wiped his eyes with his sleeve and pinned the tag to his chest, and the entire kitchen applauded for him. On the wall behind the cooking area, the woman drove in a nail and hung the faded yellow cloth bag there, the one with the scorch mark along its strap. Then she put on the first white chef's coat she had ever owned. Her 10-year-old daughter stood on a plastic chair beside the pot, wearing a tiny chef's hat Dorothy had sewn especially for her. She held the ladle handle with both hands and stirred in slow circles, her face as solemn as though she were performing the most important task in the world. When she finished, the entire kitchen erupted in applause, and she smiled until her eyes nearly closed, bowing to both sides like an actress upon a stage. On the day the renovated kitchen expanded its doors to the neighborhood, the line already stretched to the sidewalk before opening time. The first person in line was a thin man whose hair had grown much grayer than before. He wore an oversized coat, his arms crossed over his chest, his eyes lowered to the tile floor. Warren Doyle had completed his reduced sentence and been released on parole only 3 days earlier. He didn't dare look up. He stood there like a man who had come to ask for something, not a man who had once driven for an entire family. She saw him and said nothing. She simply filled the first bowl of that day, the first serving from the first pot, and placed it in his hands. Elias came out from the kitchen, stopped before him, and placed a hand on the man's shoulder. No one spoke, no apology was uttered, and no forgiveness was offered. There was only a hand resting on a shoulder, a bowl of hot soup, and the line behind them waiting patiently for its turn. At the end of the day, when the pot was nearly empty and everyone had finished eating, she reached for the ladle, intending to serve herself what remained at the bottom, just as she had done throughout those 3 years. Elias took the ladle from her hand. He filled a bowl, set it on the table, pulled out a chair, and told her to sit down and eat first. She stood there in bewilderment for a moment, because in all those years, no one had ever done that for her. Then she sat down. As she ate, he reached beneath his shirt and drew out the chain he wore around his neck. He removed his mother's ring and placed it gently beside her bowl. He did not offer it to erase her past or replace the man who had loved her, but to offer a future built on truth and safety for both her and her daughter. He told her his mother had directed him to find the woman behind the warmth, long before he understood why. When she looked at the ring with tears of healing, asking if he was certain about a woman who had lost everything, Elias replied that she was the only person in the city who had shown him unconditional kindness, and that together, they had earned the right to heal. Their story teaches us that poverty can never take away a person's dignity. Only the contempt in another person's eyes can do that. A meal given without expectation of repayment carries a healing power that money can never buy. True family doesn't always come from blood. Sometimes it comes from the people willing to stand between us and danger when we have nothing left. And the bravest thing a person can do isn't to take revenge upon those who caused harm, but to find the courage to stop the cycle. If this story touched your heart, please subscribe to our channel, press the like button, and share it so we can continue listening to more meaningful stories together each day. How did the story of Elias and that young woman make you feel, and what part of it stayed with you most? Please leave a comment below, because we sincerely want to hear the feelings that come from deep within your heart. We wish everyone watching this video abundant health, happiness, and peace in every day of your life. Goodbye for now, and we look forward to seeing you again in our next video.